Thanks so much for everyone for joining. Having just taken a short walk outside, I see it's a delightful day in Vancouver. So thanks so much for hanging in there. And I'm also mindful as well, right outside my labs and office in the War Memorial Gym, is the bus stop's right outside, and it's certainly quite noisy. So apologies if you see hear some ambient noise coming through the background. Anyway, without any further ado, so what I thought I would try and provide here is a bit of an overview of some of the work we've done in my lab, and certainly with a number of collaborators around socially connected physical activity. And for those that might seem maybe a bit perplexed about what the title might actually involve, we'll talk about what it entails, what it looks like. I'll also try and provide some empirical evidence for why those of you who may be interested in physical activity promotion and intervention, why they might be considering using groups as a means or a mechanism of behavior change. And what I'll also do is try and provide data from a range of settings as well and context. So we'll start with some work with older adults, but we've done work in this area with military veterans, pre-postnatal women, and I'll share some data from a range of settings. I know that the group is quite small, the audience quite small. So if you've got questions, I'm certainly happy to try and accommodate those as we go along. But otherwise, we'll just progress. So here we go. So in terms of the consequences of physical inactivity, and these are really quite well known, and you'll be pleased to hear I'll not spend the next 15, 20 minutes talking about those. You'll be all too aware of those. But what we can certainly take as a given is that physical inactivity has increased alarmingly over the past century. We also know that it's a major cause of premature mortality, and it's associated with a number of preventable and unhealthy conditions. We know certainly from the work in my lab, it's associated with both psychological, salient psychological outcomes and also physical outcomes as well. And we'll talk to some of those as well. What we've also seen in the context of the current pandemic, so this was a paper in JAMA that came out early on in the pandemic, is that we see that people are really struggling with mental health concerns. And perhaps contrary to what many of us expected at the outset, I think many of us thought that older adults in particular would be a risk of isolation. And in fact, this is salient because I'll talk to a randomized trial we actually ran during the pandemic that was designed to support older adults. But we see these effects particularly pronounced amongst those who are in the younger age group, the 18 to 29. And so this study compared data from early on in the pandemic in 2020 to 2 years prior in 2018. So it's a bit of a sort of why question. Why groups? Why would we even look at groups as a means of intervention? I'll maybe start off with maybe a bit of a historical piece here from Charles Darwin on the origins of species, who wrote that with those animals which were benefited by living in close association, the individuals which took the greatest pleasure in society would best escape various dangers, while those that cared least for their comrades and lived in solitary would perish in greater numbers. So very dramatic language. But what it points towards is the fact that people tend to thrive when they feel connected with others, but they'll struggle, and in Darwin's words, perish when they're isolated. Indeed, the evolutionary psychology literature has highlighted this as well, and is noted from an evolutionary perspective is that group living is a fundamental aspect of human evolution, and those humans that were successful in seeking out and maintaining group support survived to reproduce, and those that were unsuccessful or chose to be solitary were phased out. So then the question is, so how does this relate to physical activity? And I know the empiricists and the students and perhaps the professors out there will say, well, where's the data? Show me the data. So I'm going to summarize here the results of quite a prominent meta-analysis. So for those that are non-scientists and non-students, a meta-analysis involves synthesizing data from across multiple studies. And as an indication of effect, these are standard criteria in science. These are based on Cohen's criteria for effect sizes. So 0.2 is small, 0.5 is a medium effect, and 0.8 and above is a large effect. So in this analysis by Burt Karen and colleagues at Western University, in comparing those who exercise with others versus alone, there was an advantage to being active with others. And then in terms of socially cohesive and task cohesive classes, when compared to standard classes, there was a further improvement in effect. So what this points towards is, from a physical activity perspective, in terms of supporting long-term adherence, when people exercise with others in social context, and in particular in groups that are cohesive, they tend to stick with those programs more so than when they're exercising or being active on their own. In terms of some data I'll show early on about how this might relate to older adults, here's a slide, maybe slightly dated now, but the trends still hold. This is based on a paper in the Lancet, this is based on population surveillance data, which points to the fact that across countries, cultures, and continents, what we see is that older adults, so that's the bars in blue, represent the most inactive segment or cohort in society. And those data are particularly, those effects are particularly pronounced when we look at objective measures, so using accelerometry and other device-assessed measures. And in Canada, we see that amongst older, when less than 15% of older adults are currently meeting international guidelines. So given that the health benefits we know are associated with physical activity, it's then behoove of us in preventive and behavioral medicine to understand how can we get people to become and stay physically active. So an important question that really pervaded the field of preventive behavioral medicine in the late 90s, early 2000s came to this question of, to what extent do people want to exercise alone versus others? And we know that people's preferences are important. When people tend to prefer to engage in a certain behavior or a certain setting, they'll tend to engage in that setting or that behavior. And in the late 90s, Abby King out of Stanford and her colleague Sarah Wilcox were reporting, and this is based on self-report questionnaire data and fairly large data sets, that the proportion of older adults that were preferring to exercise alone far outweighed those who wanted to exercise in social contexts. And I found that rather interesting and perhaps perplexing in light of some other parallel data. So, and in fact, I saw three paradoxes at play. So the question I was asking myself at the time in the early to mid 2000s was, why are older adults ostensibly preferring a context when prominent theories, and there's strong empirical support for this, when prominent theories provide conceptual and empirical evidence that being with others is more innately natural than being alone? And when we look at self-determination theory, belongingness theory, social identity theory, and there are a slew of other perspectives that point to the importance of social connectivity. The second paradox that I thought was at play was, why are these older adults preferring a context which is actually contrary to what we see with younger adults who show a preference for more social contexts? And the third paradox I saw is, why is it that these older adults are preferring a setting that's less likely to support their long-term adherence? In fact, there's a meta-analytic data which points to the fact when people are part of these cohesive groups, they tend to stick with these programs. So, when one reflects on these three paradoxes as to why older adults are preferring contexts which are less innately natural, less likely to support younger adults, and less likely to support their long-term adherence, it got me thinking quite a bit, and I looked to what's now quite a prominent theory in social psychology and increasingly so in preventive behavioral medicine, corresponds to self-categorization theory, and in layperson terms, this really points to the importance of context. So if any of you have parents or grandparents in their 70s, 80s, maybe older, or even in their 60s, and just ask yourself, what would they think of would constitute a typical exercise class? If you go to a community center and say, well, envision an exercise class, or you might be asked to sign up for an exercise program, what do you think they'll be thinking of? And of course, it's a rhetorical question because there's only one mic on the go right now. But I think many of you, would agree they're probably thinking of classes primarily made up of people in their 20s and 30s, maybe not wearing spandex and so on these days, but wearing clothing that's reflective of what people in their 20s and 30s would wear. And it's probably quite a turn-off for people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. And so with this in mind, I asked what was, in essence, I thought quite a basic question, but it stirred things up a little bit. In that, what we did is we did a large surveillance questionnaire-based study, and we sampled people right across the adult age spectrum from the 30s right through to the 90s. And what we found, so here's on the panel on the left, we have people in the different age groups, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, and we asked them about their preferences to exercise alone. And there were no differences in those preferences across age groups. And what we then did is we asked people about their preferences to envision or picture groups made up primarily of people in their 20s and 30s. And perhaps unsurprisingly, those in their 20s and 30s like to exercise with the age-matched group, and those at the older end of the age spectrum reported a strong dislike of exercising those settings. If we extrapolate that further, we asked them about their preferences to exercise in classes made up of people in their 40s and 50s, and lo and behold, and perhaps unsurprisingly, there was this age match piece where people in their 40s and 50s reported a strong positive preference to engage in age max exercise, but a dislike to exercise with younger people and older people. And finally, when we asked people to exercise with older folks, those older folks actually reported a strong preference and a dislike of exercising with younger people. So in essence, it provides some context to this. So it's not that older adults dislike exercising in groups, it's just they dislike exercising in groups primarily made up of younger people, but they do actually like to exercise with older folks. In addition to these age match preferences, we also asked people about their preference to exercise in gender, in terms of gender composition within the class. And then what we found that for both men and women, they reported a preference to exercise in gender congruent context. So it took men exercising with men, women with women. And we found that this effect was particularly pronounced amongst those who are overweight or obese. So people who are overweight or obese reported particularly strong preference to exercise in same gender contexts. One of the limitations of doing survey-based studies, of course, especially within groups, is that as soon as you have one or two people not completing those questionnaires, you have incomplete data, and it's probably revealing of those who are probably less likely to be similar to those others that complete those measures. And so it's a challenge. And so one of the things we did at this time was actually use archival data based on complete intact classes. And then so we did, Will Dunlop and I conducted a study where we sampled their attendance data based on age similarity. So not just their age, but how similar they were to everyone else in the class. And so we had 13 group-based exercise programs actually in Vancouver, and we calculated what are called Euclidean distance scores. So this represents the average absolute difference between the participants' age and the age of every other group member in the program. So if you take this one person as an exemplar, we would look at the differences between this person's age and everyone else, and then the one in yellow would be the difference in age between that person and everyone else. And what we found after controlling for their actual age similarity was a significant predictor of adherence over the course of the program. And this ties to this to the old adage, this notion of birds of a feather flocking together, or maybe birds of a feather staying active together. And this has its roots in self-categorization theory, whereby people tend to stick with others with whom they are similar, or those with whom they affiliate or identify with. So at about the time that paper was published in the Annals of Behavioral Medicine, an older gentleman in West Vancouver was on holiday in California and phoned me up and said, "Hey, I saw your study and the results in forget which news outlet, and said, you've got to come and see what we're doing." So of course, when many of us get these sorts of phone calls, you wonder where this is going to go, but took the call and visited their program in West Vancouver, and it's called the Fit Fellas. And it's a program for men by men, and it wasn't developed with any scientists in mind. They'd, in essence, developed this out of intuition. And as you'll see from the still, this is, they wear the same color t-shirts. There is for men, doesn't involve women. It's also, if you know Vancouver, if you're from Vancouver, you know that West Vancouver is a very affluent part of the city. And so we were interested, could we draw from some of these principles which they developed? So for example, they had a photo board, a sort of hall of fame where everyone was part of the program. And their adherence levels were just remarkable, unlike anything I'd seen elsewhere. So they'd had about 40% of the participants in this program had been adherent for 10 years, and 75% had been adherent for 5 years. And if anyone does any work in the field of physical activity adherence, that's really quite remarkable. So I thought we can learn something from these folks. So, but it's a very self-selecting and very high SES demographic, but we were interested, could we take these principles and test them through a randomized controlled trial design? So we developed the group-based physical activity for older adults randomized trial. Those who do work in our field, maybe I've overdone this, we try and squeeze in acronyms into very lengthy titles. So that, anyway, I'll take my punishment for the acronym we use. But what was interesting, we produced t-shirts that had the goal acronym and had a group holding hands, and these t-shirts were like gold dust, and participants after the trial finished phoned us up and said, hey, can we drive up to Vancouver? Have you got any of those t-shirts left? And it really became a point of identity that really cleaved these participants together. So the goal trial was, we partnered with the YMCA and we ran the trial at 3 sites in the lower mainland of British Columbia. We pre-registered the trial. And we had 3 conditions, and each condition were matched in terms of dose, frequency, intensity. We invited participants to exercise 50 to 60 minutes a week, so 3 classes. And if they did this, ostensibly, they would be meeting Canadian and international physical activity guidelines. The 3 conditions, we had a age match, so similar age, older adults exercising with older adults, and then men with men, women with women. Similar age, so age matched, and then mixed gender, so men and women all mixed together. And we had a comparison control condition whereby it was mixed age, mixed gender, so older adults were exercising with younger adults, and they could select any of the group-based classes that were offered by the Y. And that provided our comparison, because this is what's offered in community centers right across Canada, and indeed North America and elsewhere across the world. So it's a 6-month trial. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the training, but what we did here is, so the instructors for these classes, we recruited volunteers, and they were all older adults, 65 and older. And so they weren't the 20, 30 something professionally trained YMCA instructors. So they were older adults, and in the same gender condition, they were gender matched as well. We also provided options for a high intensity versus a low intensity version of each of the exercises. And then we packaged them together in these different classes. So this one was called Spectacular Backsides. We used, and these were phrases that the older adults themselves came up with. They came up with the music that worked for them, as opposed to the more different tempo music the younger folks might like. And they could also mix and match the different exercises within the program. We provided up to 45 hours of training for these older adult instructors. If you're interested, we posted them on that link below, and you're free to use those. Or if you want to reach out to me, I'm more than happy to share those with you. So what we found, this is our primary outcome variable, was adherence behavior. And so SAMG is same age, mixed gender. SASG is same age, same gender, and then MAMG is the mixed gender, mixed age comparison control condition. Now, we hypothesized a priori that the same age, same gender would display further improved effects relative to the same age, mixed gender. So what this suggests is that actually having same age gender composition doesn't seem to matter, but having age match classes really does. And in fact, so the effect size was in the medium effect size range. And again, this is a randomized trial controlling for covariates, no differences in baseline in terms of physical activity behavior. And you'll also see we have invariance across gender. So men and women are adhering to the same extent. And then in terms of the overall difference across the 6 months, it equated to that effect size of 0.47 equates to a difference in 10 hours more activity in the same age mixed gender than the comparison control condition. One of the things we also tried to do is, the prior slide, the primary outcome gets at the fact there was an effect. They tended to adhere more in these age match conditions, but we were interested also in why. So we pre-registered our hypotheses as well, clinical trials, and we published a protocol document, and we specified group cohesion as a mechanistic variable that we hypothesized might explain the difference. So the first slide that we see here corresponds to the results of latent growth modeling, and what we see shortly after randomization, we see this bump in cohesion in the 2 intervention conditions, so the blue and the green lines, when compared to the red comparison control condition. And not only were there differences shortly after randomization, but they continued to become even more cohesive over time. Now, so what we then did is we tested a mediation model. I've not provided the full panel model here. We engaged in cross-lag panel modeling. So the visuals for this are really quite cumbersome. But what we found support for by looking at this, sort of looking at these autoregressive type effects, is that we found randomization to the condition predicted cohesion, which thereafter predicted adherence in the first part of the program, which thereafter predicted further cohesion and adherence over the second part of the program, which is really quite interesting. So one of the things that we often don't do in many of our trials is try and get at mechanisms that explain these effects. And what we found in this trial, and we published this in Health Psychology earlier this year in 2021, just don't have the citation here, but we found evidence that group cohesion was the mechanistic variable that accounted for those effects. What I posted here is, what have we done, and in a good sense. So, when we designed the study, we tried to build in some succession planning. So we worked with the Y that as soon as the trial finished, they would keep providing these programs. And then the trial finished, and they said to the participant, well, you can take part in any of the programs that the Y are offering. And, it's outside of my control. I don't run the Y, and I don't have any hand in programming. And about 3 months later, I have a phone call from a journalist, Ellis, who phones me up and says, do you know what's happened at the Y? So unprompted, she'd got wind of this minor rebellion or revolt from these older adults who'd phoned and badgered the YMCA to demand that their gold classes, their older adult classes, be implemented and reinstated. And so on the basis of this groundswell, they published, and the article was published on this from the journalist, but they were then felt compelled to then provide program officers and then to re-implement these age-mapped group-based programs. And a lot of the participants continued to run those programs, and indeed for years afterwards. So I think points to a bit of unintentional knowledge mobilization or outreach. I provide that maybe as a bit of a segue. So one of the questions I was interested early on, so obviously I think all of us were sort of a bit dumbstruck when the shock and awe of the pandemic kicked in early last year around March time. And obviously we're in Vancouver, we had stay-at-home mandates, we were asked to stay at home. Older adults were identified as being particularly at risk, as well as those with underlying health conditions. And we were hearing a lot of noises from multiple sectors. In fact, there was a position paper in the Lancet that pointed to the importance of developing and delivering programs for older adults. So with this in mind, it's probably a schoolboy error at the time, but I bashed together ethics and registered a trial very, very quickly for a randomized trial. I happened to have some bridge funding from CIHR, so I could use some funds to pivot, and I know that word's been overused, but to adapt some of the program that we'd initially earmarked for elsewhere to deliver this program online. So in essence, we, through various media folks, and we tried to do this through Facebook, but didn't seem to have the same impact, but we got some reasonable coverage through various media outlets. And we got the word out to say that, hey, we're running a program from the Lower Mainland for any adults in Canada. So from coast to coast, we ran these classes at 9 a.m. in the morning, 12 in Ontario, and then 1 p.m. Atlantic. And it was a different design from our gold trial, but we had adults randomized to an older adult to a group-based condition. We had them randomized to a personal condition and a waitlist control. So the group condition, we managed to recruit a bunch of senior and very experienced instructors, so older adults. We did the delivery. I think it's probably certainly one of the first trials, and hopefully the only one I'll ever do, which was designed entirely from my dining room. But we provided all the training online to older adults who are physically distant at a community center in Vancouver. And then we designed this so that each of the conditions would have the same dose, the same frequency, the same intensity of exercises. But we also built in this notion of fostering connectivity after classes. So stick around for a coffee. In the gold trial we presented earlier, older adults would hang around for sometimes an hour afterwards. They would, have a coffee, cinnamon buns, whatever. There was an a cappella group that formed, and obviously we couldn't recreate that, but we provided an opportunity to connect and check in and see how people are doing. We posted T-shirts across Canada. I was at Canada Post, sending out these along with TheraBands, which could be used to facilitate strength-based programming. And then the individual or personal condition was the same classes. They were pre-recorded, and they access those in their own time. So we posted those on Canvas, as well as the group-based programs. So if they missed a class, they could still access those group-based programs in their own time. And then we assessed, our primary outcome was psychological flourishing, but we measured other measures, a global measure of mental health and physical health. We obviously couldn't assess physical health because we couldn't go into older adults' homes or have any physical contact for obvious reasons. But we had baseline measures, and then we had measures every month for 6 months. So we could track these changes over time through latent growth modeling. So certainly, brought some challenges with running a trial, certainly all online and through Zoom. What we found in terms of adherence, when I say adherence, this is really a proxy for adherence. All this corresponds to is their attendance at the Zoom or online meeting. So with some of the computer science folks at UBC, we're able to assess whether they attended a class or not, and we encourage them to assess 3 or more classes a week. So in the panel at the top, that corresponds to the group program, and those were at the personal program. I should also say all of the participants were not meeting guidelines at baseline. So I think the median level of activity was around 60 minutes of moderate activity a week, and that's based on self-report. So this really was a sedentary group. And a couple of things are worth pointing out. So first of all, across the 2 conditions, there are no real differences in the first 4 weeks. I think it's actually notable that, this is a sedentary group, but we're getting over 50% are attending 3 or more times a week for several weeks, which I think is actually quite cool in the context of a pandemic. But what we see in the personal condition, the attendance starts to drop off a bit, whereas at the panel at the top, it holds itself quite well. So over the last 4 weeks, there's about a 10% difference in adherence between those who are taking part in the group-based program than the personal one. So if you look at the last week, it's 49 to 35%, 48 to 38 at week 10, and so on. So it points to the fact they're attending these classes or sticking with it slightly more so. So in terms of our primary outcome, this was psychological flourishing. This is based on latent growth modeling. And what we find, although the red's the comparison control condition, and when we ran our latent growth model, there are actually no significant differences between the 2 intervention and control. What this is likely due to is we've got ceiling effects, and it points to the data that we had early on, where we were expecting older adults to really be struggling psychologically, whereas in fact, they were probably the most robust and resilient to what was happening around us. But there are so in terms of our secondary analyses, what we also see is the patterns are the same. When you look at mental health measures, so this is based on a global measure of mental health. So the overall latent model showed differences between the personal and group conditions when compared to the control. No real differences between the personal and group condition, but the effect sizes appeared to be in the small to medium and medium effect size range. We also found for physical health, we saw an effect for the group-based condition, not for the personal condition when compared to the control. So I think it points to that the challenges of running a trial during a pandemic, but also, and we see this in our qualitative data, is that this provided a really viable means of keeping people active, supporting them. And what it seems is that both the personal condition, which they had that autonomy or choice that allowed them to be active when they wanted, appeared to be equally as efficacious as the group-based condition, which had that potential for social connectivity. I'm now going to switch. How are we doing for time? So I'm going to switch and talk a little bit about a few other programs. So I've spoken about older adults. I'm going to talk about some others that have, again, looked to promote physical activity, but through slightly different mechanisms or means. So the first here, you may have heard of this. Actually, we'll point to these in detail. So there's Man v Fat, which we'll talk to. There's the football fans in training, which is a slide here, which we'll talk to. Many of you at UBC will know Don McKenzie, who's across the point, who's now a Miratai prof in both family practice and also kinesiology, but was the founder of Breast in a Boat. And it's really become this global movement that supported breast cancer survivors, both with regard to physical and psychological health. And then I'll talk briefly a bit about Guy Faulkner's work on Run to Quit, using running groups as a means of smoking cessation. I'll cover these in perhaps slightly less detail than the others. But so here's the football fans in training randomized trial. The primary outcomes were published in the Lancet. And it's a really cool program because what they did here is they really used a context to which overweight and obese men are most likely going to identify with. So they use professional soccer clubs in the UK, so Rangers and Celtic and so on. And they didn't have them play soccer, but they had them attend these clubs, accessing their facilities and providing nutrition support, but also physical activity guidance. And what they found over time was clinically meaningful and substantive differences in weight loss in the intervention condition when compared to a control condition. The program which I have been involved in, this is Ben Jackson's work on men versus fat. And I had got a video, but I think it's just probably going to be a bit too challenging to share this through Zoom. But it's, if you're interested, I can send you the link to this. But what they did here, unlike the football fans in training, was they actually used sport itself as a means of weight management. So while for many of, if we think of overweight or obese youth, team sport is probably a terrifying context and less likely going to support their involvement. But in this program, they have overweight and obese men. So it's by men for men. And they share the commonality of all being overweight or obese, and that's an inclusion criteria. And then and they get additional points for both for scoring goals, but also weight loss and team weight loss. So they're accountable both to themselves and the team as a whole. And while this work is quite preliminary, this is based on a randomized trial. This is based on our feasibility work, but this is really Ben Jackson's work at University of Western Australia. They found substantive, if you think of those effect sizes, 0.80 and above being large, 0.5 being in the medium range. So substantive improvement, reductions in weight, improvements in physical activity, improvements in dietary intake, as well as improvements or reductions in depression. I'm mindful of time also, so maybe we're going through this a little fast. But if you don't know Don or unaware of him, you should. I think at UBC you should find out who he is and the work he's done. And it's really made such a substantive. Had such a substantive effect on many women, and not just in Canada and BC, but globally now. This has become a global movement. And there was a Canadian Medical Association journal piece on the origins of this. And so what was interesting is that some of the thinking at the time prior to Don starting this program is that engaging in strenuous activity would actually result in lymphedema and create quite problematic physiological responses. And in fact, they found quite the opposite. And they found it to be really quite beneficial, both in terms of physiological functioning, but also in terms of quality of life. And I've highlighted one of the quotes from one of the participants on their Breast in a Boat website, which points to the fact that we are a living symbol of hope and a vivid demonstration that there is life after diagnosis. Through the strenuous demands of dragon boat paddling, we have learned that we can push the limits of our physical endurance and have fun doing it. I know you had Guy on earlier, so hopefully he didn't speak at length to this. He's an exceptional researcher, and the part that I'm going to talk to, which directly overlaps with the work that I do, is based on his Run to Quit program, which is using, in essence, running groups as a means of supporting behavior change with in ostensibly a very different behavior, which is smoking cessation, but really using the power of groups and connectivity. And in this case, so men and women are involved, so it's not a same gender piece, but they do have that social identity and that connectivity piece of having been former or current smokers, and then they're looking to engage in substantive behavior change. So in terms, I'm not going to cover the full gamut of the data, but some of the results are particularly interesting. First of all, we see identity changes, both with regard to smoking identity and running identity. So from baseline to post-test, we see reductions in smoker identity, so the extent to which people identify as being, I'm a smoker, and improvements in running identity. So I'm an active person, I'm a runner. And these changes also seem to track through to objective markers. So when we see reductions in smoking identity, this also appears to be associated, not appears to be, is associated with reductions in objective measures of smoking behavior. And then we also see improvements in running identity. So the extent to which people then identify more so with being a runner, that was associated with increases in running frequency. And from a group-based perspective, one of the quotes from some of the earlier qualitative work highlight the fact that the big thing for me was the group, especially combining the group with the run. I desired to learn to get back to running too. So when you put the group and the running together, that was great. And what I'll leave you with is, this is the results of a fairly recent, I mean, it's maybe a couple of years now, but a fairly recent meta-analysis of controlled randomized trials that are sought to foster social connectivity and identification amongst group members. And what they found across all of those studies across settings was that when social identity and connectivity is primed or targeted through intervention, it results in substantive improvements in quality of life, improvements in physical health, improvements in self-esteem, well-being, reductions in anxiety, reductions in depression, reduced stress, as well as improvements in cognitive health. So I know I'm perhaps a little under time. I know we had a couple of videos that I've culled, but it's probably a good time to pause there. I'm happy to answer any questions. I know for many of you have been at it for almost 3 hours or so, and I'm more than happy to take any questions.